Hello, Brian Weeks here again with another MMCD contract consideration. This video clip will cover the topic of implications of optional work. The topic of optional work is one that generates a lot of confusion and questions in the MMCD courses that I teach. I think part of this results from different owners using optional work different ways, and sometimes even the same owner using it differently in different contracts. In this short video, I hope to clarify why and how owners can use optional work and the implications for both themselves and the chosen contractors. Optional work has two defining features. First, each item so defined may only be constructed after receipt of an authorizing change order. Second, because optional work items may not be authorized at all, they are specifically excluded from the general protection of price adjustment review for significant quantity underruns. Let's look at how the MMCD defines it. GC 1.48 provides a singularly unhelpful definition. Optional work means work which may be described in the schedule of quantities and prices that will be undertaken and included in the work at the election of the owner. See what I mean? Not very helpful. The key point from this definition is that items so defined will only be done if the owner gives further approval. That's the change order I just mentioned. So why have it? There are four good reasons that come to mind. First, some work items may not be easily quantifiable. By classifying them as optional, the owner is protected from claims for quantity underrun adjustments. Second, it allows the person creating the tender to build in contingency funds. This is often necessary due to municipal funding policies and the often difficult approval process to obtain additional funding should the project go over budget. Third, sometimes activation of portions of the work is outside of the owner's direct control. In such cases, the owner will want to control the start or extent of that work after the project begins. And fourth, sometimes all design choices are not finalized at the time of tendering. Yet, the owner still wants to get competitive pricing. By creating two optional work items, the owner can get that pricing without being committed to constructing that item. Keep in mind that owners do not have to use optional work category if they see no benefit. However, if they include the category, then certain contract terms become active, which is my next topic. But first, here are some examples which may help clarify the usefulness of optional work. 1. A designer anticipates that in the pipe trench location there may be rock which will require removal by blasting. Normally, the amount is wildly unknown. The owner would then include an optional work item for trench rock blasting. The amount of rock listed would be a reasonable estimate, but the owner would not be bound to that estimate. 2. The owner wants to ensure that there are contingency funds built into the project budget to cover change orders and quantity overruns. It's easy to insert an optional work item for work near the end of the project, such as final landscaping. Should the project to that point not have used up the contingency funding provided here, then the contract administrator can activate the final landscaping item with a change order that limits the amount of work to the dollar value remaining in the contingency fund. 3. A third example. Perhaps the owner is not confident that a Ministry of Environment application for some streamside work will be approved in time to do the work this season. Again, this is a perfect use for optional work. If the permit does arrive in time, the CA generates a change order to activate the work item at the bid price. I'll talk later about the schedule impacts. But if the permit does not arrive as needed, the work will not be activated and the owner bears no risk of a claim from a contractor for work that was bid but not performed. 4. A different case is where the owner wishes to get competitive pricing on a couple of ways of doing something. For example, jacking a pipe under Main Street versus the typical open trench method. Another example could be the choice between using a concrete or steel culvert. The owner can require the bidders to price both methods so that a decision can be made prior to award. The contractor has to be prepared to do either method at the owner's discretion, but everyone understands that only one method will be used. Instructions to Tenderers number 17 provides direction to both bidders and the owner when optional work is included in the schedule of quantities and prices. IT 17.1 warns the bidder not to attach general overhead or other non-specifically related costs or profits to the optional items when generating the bid cost for the line item. Each optional work item is expected to be done on a standalone basis for the price tendered. The reason is that optional work is specifically excluded from quantity underrun adjustments, hence the reminder to review the underrun limitation in GC 9.4.2. IT 17.2 warns the owner that even though some optional work items may not get built, the owner is obliged to include all optional work items when evaluating the bidder's total price for tender comparison purposes. This is also a warning to the bidders that they must be competitive on these items too, for their costs will be included in the total tender price. This will help ensure that no games are played with optional work pricing. Including alternatives in optional work will have additional implications. In my example 4 above, the owner wished to get pricing for 2 mutually exclusive methods or materials. This is a perfectly valid thing to do, but it does require a language change in the instructions to tenderers. With the standard language of IT 17.2, the owner would have to include the costs of both alternatives in the bottom line tender price, even though only one alternative will be chosen. This could cause the tender prices to be over budget, when in reality they might not be. The other problem that we've seen is that the low bidder, when both alternatives are included in the price evaluation, may not be the low bidder if the evaluation was done only on the alternative the owner preferred. Neither of these outcomes is what an owner would wish. But if you've watched another of my contract considerations, you'll know that while the owner can write just about anything it wants into the instructions to tenderers, once published, the owner must comply to the letter of that language. But the solution is quite simple. When an owner knows that only one of 2 alternatives will be chosen, the owner simply needs to state that and how the choice will be made. This is done by writing a new item into the instruction to tenderers number 4. For example, IT 4.XX, items YY and ZZ in the optional work portion of the schedule of quantities and prices are mutually exclusive. The work will include one or the other, but not both. Consequently, the owner will include only the lower of the extended price of items YY and ZZ when calculating the tender total cost for making price comparisons. In all other respects, IT 17.2 shall apply. Be cautious, however. If the owner has a preference, it must be stated in the instructions. There is case law requiring this disclosure. For instance, instead of saying the lower in the above example, the owner might say, will include the price for item ZZ if it is not more than 10% above the price of item YY, or whatever variant of this reflects the owner's preference and plan of evaluation. Now, let's look at the related general conditions. There are 3 which apply to optional work. GC 7.4.1 is the clause that restricts the contractor from doing any optional work until there is an activating change order. As with all change orders, once generated, the contractor has no choice but to comply. It's also a reminder to the CA that he or she must generate a change order before the optional work item can begin. GC 9.4.2, that's the one mentioned in IT 17.1, is the clause that specifically excludes optional work from quantity underrun adjustments. This is simply because the bidders were warned that bid prices for the optional work were not to include non-related costs. Those are the very ones that are adjustable for underruns on other items. Because there is no guarantee that any of the optional work items will be activated at all, bidders are warned to allocate general overheads and non-specific item costs to the rest of the bid excluding the optional work items. Note, however, that once an optional work item has been activated and has overrun its tender quantity by more than the threshold variance percentage, it becomes just like any other work item and is available for quantity variation price negotiations. If you look back at the wording of IT 17.1, it mentions nothing about time allowance. Because there is no certainty that any optional work items will be activated, let alone at any specific time, it is not possible for bidders to build in time to schedule for this work. For example, an optional work item might be able to be absorbed into the schedule float time if activated early in the job, but would impact the critical path if activated near the end of the job. The third relevant general condition, GC 9.5.3, is there to deal with the issue of time. It says, quote, "The related change orders shall include adjustments to the contract time as agreed by the parties." So there are two obligations here, one direct and one implied. The direct obligation is to include an appropriate allowance for time to do the optional work item when writing the change order. The implied obligation is that this duration is to be negotiated between the CA and the superintendent or other contractor representative. However, to prevent a delay of the job due to a disagreement over the amount of time to be awarded, the CA may terminate negotiations and impose a time allowance. If that allowance is inadequate, the contractor can file a formal dispute notice, and the matter will then be resolved by others using the GC17 dispute protocol. Let me go back to the trench rock example to illustrate this point. As required by IT 17.1, the contractor would have priced this rock removal at $1 per cubic meter value, including item-specific overhead costs, such as mobilizing a blasting crew and renting blast mats. But no time would have been added to the schedule because no quantity is known, nor how clustered the work will be. Let's take two extreme situations. In the first case, assume that there was little trench rock encountered, so it was sufficiently easy to work around it and get the blasting done without affecting the project's critical path. In this case, the CA would create a change order to start the work, and it would eventually be completed with the actual quantity it countered. There would be no need to negotiate additional time because the project was not delayed due to this item. At the other end of the scale, suppose the rock encountered was frequent and extensive. Each time the blasting crew had to be called in, the project had to be shut down for a day. Assume in our example, this delayed the critical path by 20 days. In this example, the change order would not only authorize the work, but also a schedule extension of 20 days. But there is a major implication to this. If the schedule is extended, there are daily site overhead costs which will be extended and must be reimbursed too. These would not have been included in the bid price because the owner would not wish to see the project schedule extended on speculative terms. Or, if the schedule was initially fixed, the owner would not have wanted the bidder to include acceleration costs for speculative delay days. Items which are eligible for additional reimbursement are those pertaining to site overheads which are both observable and measurable by a site inspector. These are things like daily costs of the site staff, staff vehicle rentals, daily security, daily traffic control equipment rental charges, trailer rentals for first aid lunch and equipment storage. This list can be quite extensive, but must be itemized and costs proven to the CA's satisfaction before the total daily delay costs for site overhead can be calculated. A 10% markup is allowed on proven costs, but persons who do not work full-time on the project and other general overhead costs would not be reimbursable as part of the daily site overhead cost. For our example, say the provable overhead site costs came to $2,000 per day, including the 10% markup for profit. Then the finalized change order would include not only activation of the work for the measured quantity at the tendered rate, but also a 20-day delay plus $40,000 for extended site overheads for those days. To summarize, optional work is an optional category of line items in the tender schedule of quantities and prices. It's put there for the convenience of the owner, perhaps to build in contingency funds, to control the amount or timing of works, or to evaluate the costs of alternative methods. When the owner includes alternatives which are mutually exclusive, the owner must alter the language of the instructions to tenderers to avoid having to include the costs for both alternatives in total tender price calculations. 3. Contractors must not do optional work until the line item has been activated by a change order. This may activate all or just a portion of the line item. Either way, the item is not eligible for quantity underrun adjustment. 4. However, should overruns occur, the item does then qualify for overrun negotiations. 5. Schedule impact of optional work is not included when tendering because neither the extent nor timing of the activation is known at that point. So when optional work is authorized, the change order must include an appropriate time extension. It is required that this extension be negotiated. 6. If a time extension is warranted, then the provable daily site overhead costs with a 10% profit markup are eligible for reimbursement and should be so noted on the change order. Only site-specific overhead costs, which are incurred by each day's delay, should be considered, not general overhead or non-related costs. I hope this has helped clarify this contract consideration. Please check our website for further assistance and to see what other topics are presented in this series. Thanks for watching.